at the end of the article, the very last screen that is there was a suicide and crisis helpline number. They did this reporting and ended it with suicide and crisis helpline because the community is just on the edge of self-harm because of restricted access to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
It is definitely one of the most powerful narratives. It's sort of their tool, their big tool is to bring out the suicide thing, because for someone who is not necessarily well informed about these issues, they're going to be really heavily impacted by those emotional, I hate to say, but it's really is emotionally manipulative. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending in February 7th, 2025. We are here with Jos and me, Arianne. First, a summary of the news. Trump issues a new executive order protecting female-only sports, with the NCAA following suit amidst a flurry of lawsuits. The U.S. State Department replaces LGBTQI+ with LGB on its website. The LA Children's Hospital quits transing patients under 19. The ACLU sues Trump about his executive order regarding gender reassignment for minors, and Argentina's president bans gender reassignment for minors. So we'll begin with some sports news. On February 5th, President Trump issued a new executive order called Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports. The executive order withdraws federal funds from educational organizations that allow biological males to compete on female sports teams. The order also orders the assistant to the President for Domestic Policy to convene with state attorney generals and representatives from athletic organizations. The order further commands the Secretary of State to, amongst other things, use all appropriate and available measures to work with the International Olympic Committee to ensure that eligibility to compete in women's sporting events is determined by sex rather than identity. It remains to be seen how Democratic politicians will respond moving forward. Will they double down on their support for boys self-identifying onto girls' sports teams, or will they quietly let this issue go? There is some indication that left-leaning media recognizes how unpopular the trans sports issue is for their side. As CNN's senior data analyst Harry Enton explains, quote, Trump's action to ban transgender women from women's sports is probably the most popular thing he's ever done, unquote. Enton went on to present polling data showing a whopping 79% of Americans support banning trans-identified males from female sports teams, up from 63% in 2021. When I checked MSNBC's website on February 6th, I did not see any stories about Trump's women's athletics executive order, although there was one story about Nancy Mace allegedly making a transphobic slur. The other stories on their website discussed issues like Trump's statements about Gaza and birthright citizenship and controversies about Elon Musk. Could this be a sign that the liberal media is trying to bury the trans sports issue rather than fight it? In any case, the effects of Trump's order are already quickly coming into fruition. Shortly after the order was issued, the NCAA issued its own statement saying that eligibility to compete in women's sports will be reserved for those who are female at birth. Meanwhile, lawsuits regarding women's sports are mounting. For example, on February 1st, Fox News reported that families are suing California Attorney General Rob Bonta over AB 1266. A state law that allowed athletes to play on sports teams according to gender identity. On February 4th, women's sports advocate Riley Gaines announced on X that 3 UPenn swimmers are suing the Ivy League universities and the NCAA, citing Title IX violations. And following Trump's executive order about women's sports, the Department of Education issued a press release saying they are pursuing investigations into San Jose State University the University of Pennsylvania, and the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association over Title IX violations. As some background, San Jose State allowed trans-identified male Blair Fleming on their women's volleyball team, provoking a number of other women's college volleyball teams to forfeit their matches against San Jose State in protest. UPenn allowed trans-identified male Leah Thomas on their women's swim team, who would undress in front of his female teammates, and a girls' high school basketball team in Massachusetts forfeited a game after a trans-identified male on another team reportedly injured 3 female players. And sports isn't the only domain where the current administration is curtailing trans activism. The federal government has begun to trim down the alphabet soup of gender and sexuality related identities on government websites. More specifically, websites associated with the US State Department are saying LGB, replacing LGBTQI+ and other comparably long acronyms. This includes websites about LGB travel information and resources for LGB prospective adoptive parents. This change has not escaped notice of activists in favor of the TQI+. In an interview with Denver 7 ABC News, Jax Gonzalez from One Colorado, the state's largest LGBTQIA+ advocacy group, candidly shared the history of the ever-growing acronym. Gonzalez admitted the acronym was originally GLB, with the L being moved to the front to honor the contributions lesbians made in the fight against AIDS in the late 80s. The T, Gonzalez confides, was only added in the late 90s. Gonzalez attributes the surge in trans awareness around that time to knowledge of the real-life story of Brandon Tina, a woman who lived as a man and who was raped and murdered in 1993 when people found out about her biological sex. Tina was portrayed by Hilary Swank in an Oscar-winning performance in the movie Boys Don't Cry. Now, I find all of this fascinating in light of what we reported last week about how the State Department's LGBTQ employee affinity group closed down, and how, as I found out through my research, how this group used to be an LGB group as early as the early 2000s. Now, with this renewed push at the federal level for LGB without the other letters, more activists are at least honestly acknowledging the history behind these labels. And Jos, what do you have?
Thanks, Arianne. Children's Hospital Los Angeles, CHLA, has announced a suspension of initiating hormone therapies for trans-identifying patients under the age of 19. This decision aligns with recent federal directives and ongoing debates about the provision of gender care for minors. The hospital's move comes in response to an executive order issued by President Donald Trump on January 28, 2025, titled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. This order mandates that federally funded medical institutions cease providing treatments such as hormone therapy and puberty blockers to trans-identifying youth under age 19. Noncompliance could result in the withdrawal of federal funding. CHLA's decision reflects the broader national debate on protecting children from gender ideology. Proponents of restricting gender-affirming care argue that minors may lack the maturity to make irreversible medical decisions and that such measures safeguard their well-being. Advocates for trans rights contend that access to gender-affirming care is essential for the mental and emotional health of transgender youth. In reaction to the executive order, California Attorney General Rob Bonta emphasized the state's commitment to offering gender-affirming care to trans-identifying youth. He warned that withholding these services could violate California's Unruh Civil Rights Act, potentially leading to legal consequences for healthcare providers. Rob Bonta and supporters of gender-affirming care often cite studies from medical organizations such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, and the Endocrine Society, which suggests that gender-affirming care is good for children who think they are transgender. However, this claim is highly debated. Some researchers and medical professionals argue that the existing studies on gender-affirming care are weak, often relying on self-reported data, small sample sizes, and short-term follow-ups. For example, a 2020 systematic review commissioned by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, in the UK found that the evidence supporting puberty blockers was of very low quality. Additionally, Sweden, Finland, and the UK have all recently scaled back access to gender-affirming treatments for minors, citing concerns over long-term risks and the lack of conclusive evidence proving their benefits. Critics also argue that the mental health struggles faced by youth could be addressed through therapy and other support systems rather than medical interventions with potentially irreversible consequences. The rise in detransitioners, those who regret their medical transition, has added further scrutiny to the claim that such treatments are the only or best way to, quote unquote, save lives. Moving now to the ACLU. From Glenna Goldis on X, quote, the ACLU sued Trump today on behalf of a medical association and others. The complaint is about gender-affirming medical care, but doesn't define gender. The complaint doesn't say WPATH, even though WPATH publishes the guidelines they rely on, because WPATH is disgraced, of course. ACLU has now filed an entire 42-page lawsuit against Trump's sex realism policies without explaining what it objects to in its definition of sex, because ACLU agrees with Trump's definition of sex. It just wants to call the concept sex assigned at birth, end quote. What I want to talk about in this segment is how mainstream news outlets are reporting on the story. Laura Barone Lopez reports for PBS NewsHour that Trump's executive order, quote, states that the federal government will not fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support the so-called transition of a child from one sex to another, and that the order also threatens to withhold federal funding from hospitals or institutions that may also happen to provide gender-affirming care, end quote. Immediately after stating what the executive order does, Laura says she wants to note, quote, that gender-affirming care is endorsed by the majority of major U.S. medical associations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, end quote. Following this, she reports on a story about a Texas family with a trans-identifying child who had been seeking medical care in New Mexico. Allegedly, the doctor in New Mexico is no longer returning their calls, so the family considered a move to a sanctuary city, in this case, Colorado. But the father is concerned about sanctuary cities being targets of the Trump administration. The dad says, quote, so we're kind of in this weird floating place where, yes, we want to get out of here, but can we really go anywhere? We're going to be safe, end quote. What a privileged life it must be when a lack of access to puberty blockers feels like a threat to safety. But let's continue with this sterling reporting from PBS NewsHour. Laura says, quote, and it's important to fact check that treatments like puberty blockers are commonly used and are reversible, and gender-affirming care for minors is rare. She continues, all gender-affirming care treatments are part of extensive evaluations between doctors and families, end quote. She does make a correction later in the segment that she misspoke and she should have claimed that gender-affirming surgeries are rare. But we know those assertions are false, and rather than report information from both sides of this topic, the segment posits that Trump's executive orders are an assault on poor and vulnerable trans people. This is demonstrative of the lack of depth in reporting from mainstream media. We have reporting from what should be an unbiased media source that this is a left versus right issue presented without consideration for facts. Instead, we get a recitation of talking points handed down by groups like the ACLU, GLAAD, Trevor Project, HRC, and others, which have all become mouthpieces for WPATH's trans agenda. And by extension, mainstream media too has become an uncritical mouthpiece for trans extremism. If this election taught us nothing, it should be that many of us leftists and left-leaning voters are looking far more critically and analytically at the media establishment, and we're not buying the garbage they're peddling. Now turning to Argentina. The AP correctly reported that Argentina's president, Javier Milei, signed a decree banning gender-affirming care for people under age 18 by reversing the 2012 gender identity law provision, which allowed such practices with parental and guardian consent. What the AP gets wrong in this line, quote, he slammed wokeism, feminism, and referred to homosexuals as pedophiles, end quote. He did, in fact, slam wokeism. He absolutely eschewed the principles of feminism, especially radical feminism, but his reference about pedophilia wasn't about all homosexuals. It was in relation to the gay couple, William and Zachary Zulak, who were sentenced to 100 years in prison after it was discovered they adopted and abused two young boys. Why do I make this distinction? because accuracy matters. And when journalists purposefully or lazily take information out of context to make an argument, it undermines any truly salient points in the rest of their reporting. When these actions happen time after time, the reporting of the agency as a whole is undermined. Does Javier Milei get some things wrong in his speech? Yes, absolutely. But to discredit everything he says as right-wing extremism and make false assertions is lazy journalism, which to me makes it useless journalism. I'll leave you with this quote from our board member Sylvia, who was the direct target of misrepresentative reporting by the AP in December at the US versus Scrimeti hearing. She says, "I just wish that journalism went back to reporting the truth instead of cultivating a narrative. At best, they remain willfully ignorant of opinions that would provide well-rounded reporting, and at worst, they are propagandists." So, Arianne, I'm curious what you think about how mainstream media reports on these issues.
It probably isn't a shock to you for me to say that I'm not happy with the way mainstream media reports on these issues. Though I think maybe I'd nuance this by saying that mainstream media, and by that, I mean established outlets like the PBS NewsHour or cable news outlets. Usually, if you look carefully enough, you can sort of untangle what is their rhetoric and their byline from hidden details of fact that are actually embedded in their story. You can sort of untangle, like they want to frame stories a certain way, and that could happen in their headlines. It could happen, the first line of their article is something very big and inflammatory or something, but then you read the details, and you can they might have exact quotes. You can sort of figure out, maybe the way they've been framing it is not actually accurate. The real established media outlets usually aren't so bold as to outright lie, right? Or make up things. They just contextualize it in a way that's very biased and selectively quote in a way that's biased. So if you're really eagle-eyed, you can often figure these things out. But that shouldn't be the burden should not be on the reader to do that, right? And I've also noticed too, since you brought up the PBS NewsHour, one thing they sometimes do is they just interview people. And that way, it's not on them reporting, it's on the person they're interviewing. So I've heard Jack Turbin being interviewed on the PBS NewsHour, and he can say all the BS he wants because he's not part of the official news team. So that's another loophole they do.
That's a really good point. And it's in the questions that they ask, because we see when they have someone like Jack Turbin, they'll give them open-ended questions and just let them run and run with whatever they have to say. But then Hillary Cass was also interviewed on PBS, and the questions were very specific. And I don't think she had in that reporting as much room to kind of be the narrator of her segment. The questions weren't nearly as open-ended. What I've noticed on NPR in particular, in my local area, in the last handful of years, is a lot more reporting about LGBTQ plus issues, all about TQ plus and the trans experience and platforming trans creators and trans artists and trans activists and just ad nauseum.
Yeah, that sort of putting the TQ plus, highlighting that with the whole acronym, which was why I was kind of excited about this ABC piece where they interviewed someone who I think identifies as non-binary, from what I can tell online, activist who was candidly talking about the history of the acronym. And even though I'm pretty sure that her intention was to be pro, the whole acronym and to say how wonderful and inclusive it is, at least she was admitting the history, which I think is great. I wish that was out there more. And I
Yeah,
think maybe more media outlets are going to be forced to be on the defensive about justifying why they are including the letters that they are and explaining what they mean by their terminology.
We can certainly hope that these distinctions are something that is made more clear. I'm a little bit leery. I think the knee jerk is going to be to try to continue the force teaming, but we certainly can hope, because of course the news is framing things as a very right left experience. So a lot of the reporting too is coming from that notion of the Trump administration disrupting the LGBTQ community and trying to break it apart and tear it asunder, and it's so horrible for the community. So yeah, I'm not going to hold my breath, but I hope that there's more distinctive reporting about the LGB experience.
Even if it's by accident.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think it was also a point that I've maybe heard or read Glenna make about how really the media is downstream of what politicians say. So people will often say like, oh, the New York Times, they're left leaning. What they really are is establishment. And in particular, they get stuff from the Democratic establishment and parrot whatever their narrative is, which in some cases is left wing. In some cases, it is not necessarily. Like on a lot of foreign policy issues, things can get not so simple in terms of how they report things. But like with the whole LGBTQ blah blah blah, they're getting things from what the Democratic Party is endorsing. And so until the Democratic Party changes, I wouldn't hold my breath on,
Yeah.
a dramatic media change.
And of course, we're not seeing any real changes from the Democratic Party and their messaging around this topic. So it's probably going to stand to bear that the media will continue to report this in the way that they are. I want to make a note. I didn't include it in the story about the ACLU suing Trump, but at the end of the article, the very last screen that is there, or perhaps it was in the video version of the article, was a suicide and crisis helpline number. So they did this reporting. Yeah, they did this reporting and ended it with suicide and crisis helpline number, because obviously the community is just on the edge of self-harm because of restricted access to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And that was, to me, really telling as well. Like the way that they look at the community and they look at this issue is definitely around that notion of at any minute trans identifying people could self-harm.
It is definitely one of the most powerful narratives. It's sort of their tool, their big tool is to bring out the suicide thing, because for someone who is not necessarily well informed about these issues, they're going to be really heavily impacted by those emotional, I hate to say, but it's really is emotionally manipulative
Yeah.
narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. And the dad in that segment also talking about being afraid for their safety and trying to find a place to be safe. Just this was like a 12 or 14-year-old kid that they were going to uproot their whole family to move to continue to get the child puberty blockers. And it's that notion of lack of safety to me. Just immediately I just thought about the privilege of a society that's the mark of safety or not. We know the reality for people is, in general, all over the world, is that's not the barrier, the mark of safety is whether or not you can access cross-sex hormones. It's just,
Even with the sports issue, I've seen people pull that out. Like I was on a social media discussion about the Trump's executive order banning trans identifying males from female sports teams, and people were giving sob stories about I am the parent of a trans kid, and this is an assault on our family, a personal assault, like, and there are a lot of people liking these comments too,
yeah.
you know for not being able to participate on a sports team that isn't your kid doesn't even belong on. I mean, because it's an issue that is so irrational. It's so unpopular. The only thing they can resort to are these really emotionally manipulative arguments.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Because there is no argument. So that's what they have to draw. They have to draw to that. It's pure manipulation. And I think just a lot of Americans in particular have had enough. And left-leaning Americans too, like we're not buying this nonsense anymore. I'm not buying this nonsense anymore. Like there's so many people like me who are diehard, extremely progressive people, extremely left-leaning people who have just had enough.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully everyone will use their voices and talk about how you've had enough and don't let this nonsense pass by. Like pay attention when they're making these audacious claims and these emotional ploys to manipulate you, and don't be manipulated. And I also want to say, like what you mentioned about the AP, we shouldn't have to dissect the journalism that we're reading. Like I at this point, I don't trust really anything that's coming from the AP anymore. Looking at other stories about DEI was similar really, really lazy reporting. And the thing that is breathtaking to me, and I want people to really pay attention to this when they look at media, is how much one article will be taken and then reprinted or republished on multiple other sites. So in this case, I was looking at DEI reporting about West Point club shutting down, and the one AP article was republished on the New York Post, on MSN, on the Military Times. It was just exactly the same verbatim reporting published on all these different outlets. And if you're not paying attention, then you might think that that's their own reporting. You have to look for that little byline that says that it's a republish of AP, and that same narrative is being driven on all these different platforms. So it's an assault on our intellect as well.
That is an excellent point about multiple attestation, or what seems to be multiple. I think some people find a story more credible because they can get more information if multiple different outlets are reporting on the same story. Actually, if you look between the details, it's an AP story that everyone else is using, right?
Yeah, this was the big highlight for me. It was the through line was the AP reporting and how biased and lazy, how extremely lazy the reporting was, and really not presenting both sides or any critical thought in the reporting. So, uh, yeah, doing recordings for this news segment, we always look to multiple sources, and that's when it becomes just glaringly obvious that a lot of times there's not a lot of sources. It's just one source that's regurgitated all over the place.
And on that note, be eagle-eyed about all the journalism that you're seeing. And we hope to see you again next week. Thank you, everyone.